This video is sponsored by Squarespace. Now, on my most recent trip to Breckenridge, Colorado, I was able to bring the DJI Mavic 3 Classic with me. And being from California, I'm not able to get out to the snow that often, so it's always nice to be able to capture something a little bit different. And the one thing you'll notice right away is that when flying your drone at high elevations, as well as in cold weather, it does perform a little bit different. So in this video, I just want to go through with you a bunch of different tips that I learned when flying your drone in cold weather. And even though in this video, I did fly the Mavic 3, a lot of these tips, of course, will apply to whatever drone you are flying, whether it's a Mini 3 or even this one, the Mini 2. And for the very first tip, the number one thing you're going to want to do with whatever drone battery you're using is you want to keep your batteries warm. Now, lucky enough for me, I was flying right out my door from my hotel, so I was able to keep my drone batteries indoor as long as possible before taking them out for flight. Batteries do perform better when they're nice and warm and not really cold if you were to take them out there for your first flight. One thing you can do to keep them warm is keep them inside of your jacket pocket, kind of close to your body, so your body heat and your jacket ideally will keep them warmer. Or if you have those hand warmers, you can also put those next to your battery, whether it's in your pocket or inside of your bag. But the one you want to do, make sure your batteries are nice and warm before getting out there for your flight. And for my next step, let's talk about takeoff and landing. And that's of course something you're going to want to do on a nice, flat, dry surface when possible. But of course, when you're out there flying and it was snowing or it is snowing, that's not always easy to do. The one thing you want to look for is just some dry sidewalk or a dry rock that you're able to take off from, or if you're able to take a landing pad with you, that also works really well on top of the snow. One thing I like to do is hand launch and hand catch when it's not windy outside. And if you guys want a little bit more information about that, I have a full video listed above as well as down below. Definitely that's something you want to do if you are new to flying drones, but it's a really good option, especially if it is snowing outside and you don't have a nice dry place to take off from. Next one we'll talk about is GPS lock. Now, ideally, like I said, you're going to want to take off outside on something dry, but I actually took off from my balcony. And the one thing is that when it was sitting there on my balcony, I wasn't able to get a strong GPS satellite lock. When I started up the motors and launched it from my patio, I did not have a GPS lock. So in order for me to get that GPS lock, even though I was flying from my patio, I took the drone up and I flew it about 50 feet away from me. And now that the drone was out there in the open, it was able to then get a strong satellite GPS lock on the drone. You want to make sure you have that home point set before you really take off, because if there's any issues with the drone and it has to return back to home, it's going to again go back to that home point. If you took off and you didn't have a strong satellite or GPS, then it does not have that home point registered. You might have some issues there up in the air. And before we get into our next important tips, a quick word from today's sponsor, Squarespace. And for those aren't familiar with Squarespace, Squarespace is my go-to. It has been my go-to online resource in order for me to create my website for my personal brand as well as my business. I launched my FlytPath website in 2016 and I still use that same site today. The great thing about Squarespace is that they have a really intuitive content management system, and also as far as designs go, they have some of the best looking design templates on the market. The one new feature on Squarespace that I'm starting to move some of my things over to is their online merchandise store. I currently have a lot of my clothing merchandise on a third-party website, but what's great about Squarespace is that they now have a full integrated platform if you wanted to put your personal brand or your business on a bunch of different merchandise. I've been selling my flight cases through the e-commerce section on their website, and I'm starting to now move over a lot of my clothing. So if you're a content creator or have a personal brand or business and you want that foundational website, make sure to check out Squarespace, and they're offering my viewers a free trial as well as 10% off your very first purchase. The next thing we'll talk about are these obstacle avoidance sensors. Now, the one I did notice when I was flying my Air 2S last year is that my drone would sometimes move and then slow down. And I believe, and I'm not 100% sure, but I believe that the sensors, the obstacle avoidance sensors on that drone was picking up that snow in the air. So the one thing I did do this year is that once I took the drone up in the air and I knew I was above everything, I did turn off obstacle avoidance just so that I don't have those small micro possible movements from the obstacle avoidance sensing something like the snow falling. Now note, if you do have the obstacle avoidance off and you had to go back and return to home or something were to go wrong, just know that it is off, so the drone, like stuff like the Mavic 3, won't be able to dodge those obstacles on the way back. But for the most part, what I'll do is normally turn them off, try to get specific types of flight, and then if I know I'm going to be coming back or bring the drone back, then I'll turn it back on. One accessory you're going to want to have are warm gloves, or at least gloves like these. These are from PGY Tech, and I've been using these for the past few years now. And what's great about these gloves is that it does keep you nice and warm and insulated. But if you wanted to actually touch the sticks with your fingers, you can actually do that just by popping these tops off. If you're out there flying and you want to be able to have that feel on the remote control sticks, just like that. You are able to do that with these types of gloves. These are from PGY Tech. I'll leave these in the video description. I believe there's a bunch of other ones out there, but these are the ones I've been using. Feel really nice when you're flying. You get to touch your screen, but the rest of your fingers and your hands are nice and warm. Now, when I flew the Mavic 3 out there, I did bring the RC Pro remote control with me, and I highly recommend these or this one right here. These can take a little bit more tolerance when it comes to cold and hot temperature. Now, for my next tip, which is extremely important if you are flying with something like the RCN1 remote control that uses something like your cell phone, you want to make sure you have a full battery before your flight, and not just that, you want to find a way to keep your phone nice and warm, especially when it comes down to the iPhone. Whenever it gets too cold outside, the phone will just straight turn off. Also, when it gets really, really hot, you'll see that temperature icon on there and it'll also shut down. And the one thing you're gonna have to resort to is just coming back home, hitting that return to home on the remote and coming back home. And that's the reason why I like flying sometimes with these remotes. It's able to take the cold weather and the hot temperature a lot better than something like your mobile device. The next tip we'll talk about is the camera angle. So when I was out there flying, and if you were to fly just kind of straight like that, and you know the gimbal would be straight, you can actually see a lot more snow coming directly at the camera. Now, even though it might look kind of cool for a little bit, sometimes you can get a little bit of buildup on that lens. So what I started doing is flying a little bit higher and then bringing my camera, pointing my camera down just a little bit, just to avoid some of that direct contact from the snow. A couple tips you could do to avoid that snow on your camera is to either fly in reverse, or what I like doing is just flying sideways, giving that drone just a little bit of an angle sideways, as well as pointing that camera down just a little bit. You will avoid some of that snow building up on the camera. Now, earlier I talked about keeping the battery warm, especially when you are taking it up there for that first flight. But the next tip I recommend doing is bringing your drone back a little bit earlier. Now, for me, I like to normally fly my drones about to the 20 to 25% mark before bringing it back. But when you're out there in cold weather, I will normally bring it back now within 40, 50% left on the battery. And especially if you're out there at higher elevations and that cold weather, the drone and those motors are gonna be working a lot harder. Which means once I get around that 50% mark, I will normally keep the drone in real close proximity to me, because at any point the battery could start draining a little bit faster. And one thing you don't want to do is be at a far distance trying to have the drone work twice as hard to come back home. Once you get the drone back home, next thing I normally will do is just check the drone, see if there's any buildup on it itself, see if the lens is clean, see if there's any things on the props, because when you are out there flying, you could definitely build up some moisture on the drone, on the camera, on the lens, as well as on the props. So every time you bring it back in, just do a quick overview and inspection of your drone. Next thing we'll talk about is filters. Now, I was flying the Mavic 3 Classic out there, which has the adjustable aperture, but if you're flying something like the Mini 2 and some of the other ones, the Mini 3, where you don't have an adjustable aperture and you want to dial that shutter speed in, it can be kind of tricky in this snow because everything is sometimes just like a full whiteout. So you might want to look at getting some filters for your drone. So if you're using a fixed aperture type of drone and you still want that 180-degree rule, you're going to need something like an ND filter set. This is the freewheel gear filter for the Mavic 3, and of course they have a bunch of other ones for all the other drones. I'll leave the links to the ones I've been using in the description below. And for my final tip, the one thing I would suggest using is the maps, especially when coming back home. Sometimes if you're out there flying and the snow starts coming down, that visual line of sight might be obstructed. The one thing I'll do is I'll open up my maps and look at the angle of my drone, and that red line is that direct line from your drone back to your home point. What I'll do is I'll just quickly open up the maps, turn my drone back around so it follows that line, just hit forward, and that drone should now work its way back to the home point. And there it is, guys, just a bunch of tips I was able to come away with after flying my drone in higher elevation and in cold temperature. Huge thanks to our sponsor of this video, Squarespace. If you are looking at creating your online website for your personal brand or business, make sure you guys use those links down below. You guys get a free trial as well as 10% off your very first purchase. If you guys want more tips about flying your drone, whether it's the Mini 2, Mavic 3, make sure you guys check out these videos right here, as well as a full list down below in the video description. Hopefully you guys got some value from this video, and if you did, a big like would be much appreciated. This is Ultra Saucio with FlytPath.com. I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care.